Watercolour might look tricky and confusing, but it's one of the easiest, cheapest and quickest ways to create stunning art like this. Let me show you the complete basics of watercolour and how to get started today. So what will we need? To begin, you will obviously need some watercolour. I use these pans or trays of watercolour. I like them because of how compact they are, easy to store and easy to bring around. You can also get watercolour in tubes of paint or in concentrated bottles. Secondly, you'll need paper, preferably watercolour paper, with a minimum of 300 grams per metre squared. Watercolour paper is preferable to any other paper because it doesn't bend when you put water onto it. With most normal papers, when you add water, it begins to warp and shape in weird ways and can lead to weird effects. Thirdly, you'll need some paintbrushes. Any paintbrush will do. You don't need any fancy watercolour paintbrushes. I'll use this one for today. Next, you'll need some paper towel, or I prefer to use this reusable cloth just so I don't create as much waste. You'll also need a glass or jar of water. Anything will really do. Some people like to use 2 glasses of water, one clean and one dirty. Next, you'll need some testing paper. This is optional, but I like to use a notebook to make sure that all of my colours are consistent. We'll go into this in further details later on. Okay, so once you have everything, I like to set it up like this as a right-handed person because you'll find that this is the area that you're using the most. So, just to explain quickly what everything's used for, obviously the water to wet and clean your brush, the paint to pick up the pigment. This pad is used for testing and making sure that you have consistent same colours and that you're putting down the pigments that you'd like. This is to dry and remove any liquid from your brush that you don't want. And this would be your canvas. This is what you're doing, main piece of work. So it's very simple really. Just to get started, you just wet the brush. Then you want to wet whatever colour you're doing just by dropping a couple of drops in there. And then you can just pick up the paint like normal and paint away. And what you'll find is after some strokes your paintbrush will start to lose its pigment. So you'll see by the end of it there, we started off very saturated and lost the pigment. So there is 2 main ways to do watercolour painting. One is called wet on wet and the other is called wet on dry. In wet on wet, it refers to having a wet paintbrush and painting onto a wet canvas, which means that you get a clean brush and you wet your paper. So you'll just wet your paper like that and then pick up whatever pigment you want. And you'll see here now when I start to touch it, the pigment will kind of move around that water. See the way it kind of flows through it, and you see as I pull it out it starts to lose some of its saturation. And the reason that was so flowy is because this is poor quality paper, but if you go onto watercolour paper like this, it won't flow as much. So you see if I add some water again and now pick up some pigment on my brush, doesn't flow quite as much. It kind of stays there until you drag it with you, but this is nice to create smooth, even textures and often used in the first layer of painting. Honestly, I don't use it as much as the other technique just because you can't get as clean, straight lines as you can with the other technique. The other technique, which is of course wet on dry, which is what I mostly use, and that is quite simply getting your wet paintbrush and painting onto a dry page, and this gives you more control, what I think, and more clean and straight lines, and I prefer to use it. I'll use wet on wet at the very beginning stages, but once I'm trying to get any details I'll use wet on dry. And before you start, a key thing to know about watercolours is that they're very opaque. So what that means is you're going to see the colours underneath them. So if you start with your darkest colour, let's just say black here, and then you try to put a pink on top of it, it simply won't work. You won't be able to add in your highlights. It'll all just get mixed up. and it won't look good. But if you add your pink first, and let's say now you want to add the shadows instead, you can add that shadow in and you can still get those clean pink lines as well. So essentially, when you're painting with watercolour, you want to put down your lightest colours first and work to your darkest colours, because if you put your darkest colours down first, you're not going to be able to see your lighter colours. Another thing to note is when the paint does dry, the pigment changes slightly. It gets a little less dark. So if you put down a green like this, when it dries it will get a little lighter, especially if when you put it down it is quite wet. Another thing is when you have a stroke like this that is pretty wet, you can take your paper towel and you can actually remove a lot of that pigment. So if you don't like something, you can remove a bit of it, but you can't remove all of it. But that is something that if you work quickly, you can remove some of your strokes if you don't like them. Another piece of advice I'd have is to use your testing pad. It's there for a reason, and people might wonder why you want to use it, because as you've seen here, you run out of pigment very quickly and you don't want to be wasting strokes on this useless piece of paper. But let's say you're doing a sky, and say this is your original sky colour on your main sheet, just like that. That is your sky. And now you go to get more blue because you've ran out of paint, and when you come back it's a completely different colour because you haven't measured your quantities of water right, and now your sky does not look how you want it. Instead, what you should do is, once you've put that first colour down, get your blue again and just test on your sheet. Go, okay, that's not the colour I need. Maybe I need to add a little bit more water. Okay, that's better, but it's still a little bit too blue. Maybe if I just add a tiny bit more water, I'll get the colour I want. And boom, there's the colour I want. And bang, you have the perfect colour. So definitely make sure to use your testing pad, especially if you're doing any important paintings or things like that. But the main piece of advice that I would have for using watercolours is just to go out and experiment. It is by far what I think like the easiest and most accessible methods of doing art. It's a lot easier than some other methods, like even acrylic paint, and you can bring them around literally anywhere with you, especially if you've small trays like this. You can just put that in your pocket and paint wherever you want, whenever you want. So, and the most learning you'll do is when you're actually realizing them with yourself, when you're going through and saying, oh look, that actually does happen when I use that much water. So if you think I've missed anything, or if you've anything else to ask, make sure to put it down in the comments below, and I hope you got some enjoyment out of this video.